During a youth talent contest, the judge was frozen upon hearing a young woman play a song, the same one his loved one composed before dying 13 years ago. Jackson Rivers sat in the dimly lit study of his sprawling mansion, the faint notes of an old piano composition echoing in his mind. The room, once filled with life and music, now felt like a tomb. Dust coated the keys of the grand piano in the corner, and framed photos on the shelves were his only companions. His gaze lingered on one picture in particular, a snapshot of his wife, Rachel, holding their daughter Zoey, her curly hair bouncing as she laughed. That image haunted him, a frozen reminder of everything he had lost. It had been 10 years since the tragedy, yet the weight of that day pressed on his chest like it had happened yesterday. The headlines had been relentless. Millionaire composer's family lost at sea. The investigation had ruled it an accident. An unforeseen storm, they claimed. But no amount of official explanations could erase the guilt that gnawed at Jackson. If only he hadn't left them to handle business. If only he had been there. Maybe he could have saved them. "Mr. Rivers?" A voice interrupted from the doorway. It was David, his longtime assistant. The man had grown used to Jackson's brooding silence over the years. "The young talent competition is next week. They've confirmed your seat on the judging panel." Jackson waved a hand dismissively. "Fine, make the arrangements." David hesitated, sensing his employer's reluctance. "You don't have to do this if it's too much." "I said it's fine," Jackson snapped, his tone sharper than intended. He softened, running a hand through his graying hair. "I need to stay busy, David, otherwise..." He trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence otherwise. The ghosts would consume him. The competition was an annual event showcasing prodigious young musicians. Jackson had agreed to be a judge out of obligation more than interest. Music had once been his lifeblood, but now it felt like a cruel reminder of what he could never reclaim. The following week arrived faster than Jackson expected. He found himself seated in the front row of an elegant theater, surrounded by other judges and a crowd buzzing with anticipation. The stage was illuminated by warm lights, and one by one, contestants took their turns, filling the space with melodies that ranged from technically impressive to deeply moving. Still, Jackson remained detached, applauding politely but feeling nothing. Music had lost its magic for him, reduced to hollow notes and rhythms. That was until she walked onto the stage. A young woman, no older than 19, approached the piano with an air of quiet confidence. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her eyes carried a glimmer of determination. Something about her struck Jackson immediately, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. The first notes she played sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just her technique, though it was flawless. It was the melody itself, a hauntingly beautiful piece that only he, Rachel, and Zoey knew. His heart began to pound as the realization hit him. This was their song. The piece he, Rachel, and Zoey had composed together during one of their many family nights at the piano. They had laughed, experimented with harmonies, and finally created something uniquely theirs. It was a private treasure, never written down or shared with the world. And yet, here it was, being played by a stranger. Jackson leaned forward, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. Every note pulled him further into a whirlpool of memories, and for the first time in years, he felt his emotions threatening to spill over. When the performance ended, the audience erupted in applause, but Jackson barely heard it. He sat frozen, staring at the girl as she stood and bowed gracefully. Her name, Jasmine, flashed on the screen above the stage. How could she know this song? As the other judges murmured praise for her performance, Jackson barely managed to compose himself. When the competition ended for the evening, he instructed David to find out everything about the girl. "Everything?" David asked, his brow furrowed. "Everything," Jackson repeated, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Later that night, Jackson sat in his study, the performance replaying in his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers. Who was Jasmine? How had she come to know the melody that only his family could have known? The question burned in his chest, bringing with it a flicker of something Jackson hadn't felt in a decade. Hope. For the first time since the tragedy, he allowed himself to imagine the impossible. Could Jasmine be connected to Rachel and Zoey? And if so, how? As the clock struck midnight, Jackson made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The days following the competition were a blur for Jackson. His mind was consumed by questions, memories, and the haunting melody that Jasmine had played. He barely slept, spending most nights at his desk, poring over the few details David had managed to uncover about the young musician. Jasmine Brooks, David had reported, 19 years old, raised by a small fishing family in Maine. No formal music training. She says she learned to play by ear. Jackson frowned at the simplicity of the details. It was too little to explain the staggering talent he had witnessed. Or more importantly, her connection to his family's private composition. Any mention of her biological parents? Jackson had asked, trying to sound detached. No, David replied. She was adopted, found on a beach when she was about 6 years old. There's no record of who her birth parents were. The words hit Jackson like a tidal wave. A child found on a beach at 6 years old, the same age Zoey would have been when she disappeared. He felt his breath catch, but he forced himself to remain composed. It couldn't just be a coincidence, could it? A week later, Jackson found himself sitting in the audience of another performance. Jasmine was playing as part of a smaller showcase, a prelude to the competition's final round this time. Jackson couldn't focus on her technique or the music. All he could see was the way her hands moved across the piano keys, so eerily reminiscent of Rachel's. When the performance ended, Jackson didn't wait for the applause to die down. He slipped backstage, ignoring the curious glances of staff and other contestants. His heart raced as he spotted Jasmine in the hallway, chatting with another young musician. "Jasmine!" he called out, his voice more urgent than he intended. The girl turned, surprised to see him. Her companion stepped away, sensing the weight of Jackson's presence. "Mr. Rivers," she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "I need to speak with you," Jackson said, trying to mask the emotions bubbling under the surface. "Alone." Jasmine hesitated, glancing around. She seemed unsure of what to make of the famous composer standing before her, his intensity palpable. "Okay," she said softly. He led her to a quiet corner backstage, where the muffled sounds of the showcase faded into the background. "You played beautifully," he began, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers for answers. "That melody, where did you learn it?" Jasmine blinked, caught off guard. "The one I played at the competition?" "Yes," Jackson pressed. "That piece, it's not common. In fact, it's impossible for you to have heard it before. So tell me, how do you know it?" Jasmine's brow furrowed as she tried to process his words. "I've known that song for as long as I can remember," she said slowly. "I don't even know where it came from. It's just always been in my head. I thought I made it up." Jackson's throat tightened. He struggled to keep his emotions in check, but the implications were overwhelming. "Always?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded. "Sometimes I feel like I've heard it before, though, like it's tied to something important, but I don't know what." Jackson stared at her, his mind racing. Could this girl really be Zoey? The timeline matched, and the details of her past were a void, just like the years following the tragedy. But how could she have survived the naufragio? And why hadn't she remembered anything? "I need to know more about you," he said, breaking the silence. "Your childhood, your family, anything you can tell me." Jasmine shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what there is to say. My parents, the ones who raised me, they're just simple people. They found me on the shore one day, near their fishing village. I was alone, crying. I didn't even know my name. They told me I couldn't speak for weeks after that." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were aligning in a way that terrified and exhilarated him. "And you've never tried to find your biological family?" he asked carefully. Jasmine shrugged. "I thought about it, but my parents always said it didn't matter. They loved me like their own, and I never wanted to hurt them by digging into the past." Her words were sincere, and Jackson could see the love she had for the family who had taken her in. But he couldn't let it end there. "Would you consider trying now?" he asked. Jasmine tilted her head, studying him. "Why does it matter so much to you, Mr. Rivers?" Jackson hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not without more certainty. "Because," he said finally, "I think your past might be more important than you realize." That night, Jackson returned home with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He called David immediately, instructing him to hire a private investigator to look deeper into Jasmine's history. "Leave no stone unturned," he told David. "I need answers." As Jackson ended the call, he sat back in his chair, staring at the photo of Rachel and Zoey on his desk for the first time in a decade. He felt something stir in his heart, a glimmer of hope. If Jasmine was truly Zoey, then maybe, just maybe, this broken melody of his life could finally find resolution. The investigator Jackson had hired worked quickly, and within days, new fragments of Jasmine's past began to emerge. Her adoptive parents, a kind and reserved couple named Arthur and Marlene Brooks, had found her washed ashore near their small fishing village in Maine. The girl, soaking wet and terrified, had clung to Marlene in silence. It took weeks for her to utter her first word, and even longer to adapt to her new life. They named her Jasmine because she couldn't remember her real name, David explained during one of their daily briefings. "There's no record of her in the system before that day. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Jackson sat in his study, processing the details with a mix of disbelief and longing. The similarities between Jasmine's story and what could have been Zoey's survival were undeniable. But he needed more. Proof that could confirm what his heart was already beginning to believe. That afternoon, Jackson arranged to meet Jasmine at a small cafe near the competition venue. She had hesitated at first, wary of his intense interest in her life, but her curiosity about his intentions eventually won out. Jasmine arrived with her usual understated demeanor, dressed in a simple cardigan and jeans. She looked like any other 19-year-old, yet to Jackson, every detail about her, her posture, her expressions, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, felt like a memory brought to life. "Thank you for coming," Jackson said, gesturing for her to sit. Jasmine studied him as she took her seat. "I'm not sure why I'm here. You barely know me, but you seem invested in my life." Jackson smiled faintly, though the weight of his emotions made it hard to hold. "You could say your story resonates with me. I know what it's like to have unanswered questions about the past." She tilted her head, curiosity flashing in her eyes. "Unanswered questions about what?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "About family, loss, things that don't make sense no matter how much you try to piece them together." Jasmine nodded slowly, as if his words struck a chord. "I've always wondered about the family I lost," she admitted. "I used to imagine they were out there looking for me, but as I got older, I realized it was probably just a fantasy." Jackson leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "What if it wasn't?" She frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "What do you mean? What if the family you lost has been searching for you all this time?" His voice was steady, but his heart raced. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly shook her head. "That's impossible. It's been 13 years. If they wanted to find me, they would have by now." Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a copy of the one on his desk, the picture of Rachel and Zoey. He slid it across the table toward her. "This is my family," he said quietly. "My wife Rachel and my daughter Zoey. They were lost at sea when Zoey was 6 years old." Jasmine stared at the photo, her expression unreadable. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because," Jackson said, his voice catching slightly, "there's a chance you might be Zoey." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Jasmine blinked, confusion and disbelief etched across her face. "That doesn't make any sense," she said, shaking her head. "I would remember something like that, wouldn't I?" "Maybe not," Jackson replied gently. "You were found on a beach, alone and frightened. You didn't speak for weeks. It's possible the trauma blocked out your memories." Jasmine looked down at the photograph again, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The little girl in the picture had bright eyes and a playful smile so full of life. "So, could that really have been her?" "I don't know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't feel real." "I don't expect you to believe me right away," Jackson said. "But if there's even a chance, don't you want to know the truth?" Jasmine hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent years wondering about her past, but the idea that it might connect her to someone like Jackson Rivers felt overwhelming. Still, something deep inside her stirred, a sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. "What are you suggesting?" she finally asked. "A DNA test," Jackson said without hesitation. It's the only way to know for sure. Jasmine looked up at him, her expression guarded. And if it turns out I'm not her, Jackson took a deep breath, forcing himself to confront the possibility. Then I'll accept it, he said honestly. But if you are, Jasmine, it would mean the world to me to have my daughter back. She bit her lip, her emotions warring on her face. Okay, she said at last. I'll do it. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. The possibility of Jasmine being Zoey consumed his thoughts. He replayed their conversation over and over, clinging to the hope that he might finally be on the verge of a miracle. In her small apartment, Jasmine stared at the photo Jackson had given her. The faces of Rachel and Zoey felt like a dream, distant yet strangely familiar. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to find a family she had never known. Both of them, separated by years and pain, lay awake, wondering if their lives were about to change forever. The DNA test results would take weeks to arrive, leaving both Jackson and Jasmine in a state of restless anticipation. But for Jackson, waiting was never his strong suit. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Sitting in his study, he reviewed the investigator's report again, searching for something, anything that could confirm his suspicions without the test results. Jasmine's adoptive parents, Arthur and Marlene Brooks, had been vague in their recollections of finding her. The investigator's notes stated, found on the shore near Cape Elizabeth, clinging to debris. No significant injuries except for mild hypothermia and exhaustion. The description matched what Jackson had always feared. Zoey may have survived the naufragio, alone and terrified. He picked up the phone and dialed David. I need you to arrange a meeting with Jasmine's adoptive parents, he said. David hesitated. Are you sure that's wise, Mr. Rivers? This could stir up unnecessary complications. It's necessary, Jackson replied firmly. I need to hear their story firsthand. 2 days later, Jackson arrived in the small fishing town of Portland, Maine. The Brooks' home was modest, tucked away near the harbor. The smell of salt water filled the air, and the distant cries of seagulls created a melancholic backdrop to his visit. Arthur and Marlene greeted him with cautious smiles. They were a warm, unassuming couple, clearly unsure why a man of Jackson's stature would take such an interest in their daughter. Thank you for meeting with me, Jackson began, his tone polite but direct. I wanted to talk to you about Jasmine's past, specifically the day you found her. Marlene's expression softened, her maternal instincts kicking in. She's a special girl, she said. We never expected to raise a child, but when we found her, we knew she was meant to be ours. Arthur nodded. She was so small and scared, barely said a word for weeks. It broke our hearts to think about what she'd been through. Did she ever say anything about where she came from? Jackson asked. Leaning forward slightly, Marlene shook her head. Not much. The first clear memory she mentioned was being in the water, clinging to something. She said it was cold and dark, and she was scared. But that's it. We never pushed her to remember more. Jackson's chest tightened. The image of Zoey, alone in the vast ocean, flashed in his mind. And the debris she was found with. Do you remember what it was? Arthur scratched his chin thoughtfully. It was a piece of wood, I think. Part of a railing, maybe. We didn't think much of it at the time. Just figured it was from a wreck of some kind. Jackson's heart pounded. He knew the yacht's design intimately. The railings had been custom-made from a rare type of mahogany. If the debris matched, it would be another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Do you still have it? Jackson asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Marlene's brows knitted together. I'm not sure. We might have kept it in the shed with some of the old things from when we found her. I could check. Please, Jackson said, the urgency slipping into his tone. While Marlene searched the shed, Arthur invited Jackson to sit on the porch. The two men exchanged polite conversation, though Jackson's mind was elsewhere. After a few minutes, Marlene returned, carrying a weathered piece of wood. This is it, she said, handing it to Jackson. His hands trembled as he examined the fragment. The wood was unmistakably mahogany, with a faintly carved edge that matched the yacht's ornate design. It was a piece of his past, a shard of the life he had lost. This was from my yacht, Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur and Marlene exchanged a glance. their expressions shifting to concern. "What does this mean?" Arthur asked. Jackson looked up, his eyes glistening with restrained emotion. "It means Jasmine might be my daughter." The revelation left the Brooks stunned. Jackson explained his theory, how the timeline, Jasmine's age, and the circumstances of her discovery aligned with the tragedy that had defined his life. "I don't want to take her away from you," Jackson assured them, seeing the worry in their faces. "You've given her a life I couldn't, and for that, I'll always be grateful. But if there's even a chance that she's my Zoey, I have to know." Marlene nodded slowly, her maternal instincts understanding his plea. "We've always known she came from somewhere special. Maybe this is her chance to find out where she belongs." That evening, Jackson returned to his hotel room with the piece of wood in hand. It felt like holding a piece of Zoey herself, tangible proof that she might have survived. He set it on the nightstand and poured himself a drink, his thoughts racing. The DNA test would provide the final answer, but Jackson no longer felt like he needed it. Deep down, he already knew. Jasmine was Zoey. She had to be. Still, questions lingered. How had she ended up alone in the ocean? Why hadn't Rachel survived? And who else might have been involved in the tragedy? As Jackson stared out the window at the dark sea beyond, he made a silent vow. He would uncover the whole truth, no matter how deep he had to dig. The morning brought a cold clarity to Jackson's mind. The fragment of mahogany from the Brooks shed confirmed what his heart had already suspected. Jasmine was his Zoey, but it also reignited questions he had buried for years. If the yacht's naufragio wasn't an accident, as the investigators' preliminary report suggested, then someone had orchestrated it, and that someone had taken everything from him. Jackson's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was David. "I've got news," David said, his tone measured. The investigator dug deeper into the yacht's records and the crew's reports from that day. "There's something you should know." "Go on," Jackson said, gripping the phone tightly. There were irregularities in the yacht's maintenance logs, apparently. Someone tampered with the vessel's stabilizer system before it set out. It was subtle, but enough to compromise the yacht in rough waters. Jackson's blood ran cold. Tampered by who? "That's where it gets complicated," David continued. "The logs were altered by someone within your family's company. The investigator found a name, Jeffrey Morris." Jackson's grip on the phone tightened. Jeffrey, his cousin, had always been an opportunist, but Jackson had never imagined he'd go this far. Growing up, they had shared a competitive relationship, but it had always seemed harmless. Jeffrey had taken over certain aspects of the Rivers estate while Jackson focused on his music. Why would Jeffrey do this? Jackson muttered to himself. "Money," David replied flatly. "You know how he's always wanted control of your assets. With you gone, he would have been the primary beneficiary of the Rivers' fortune." Jackson clenched his jaw, fury bubbling beneath the surface. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and they painted a picture of betrayal that was almost too cruel to believe. "I want everything on Jeffrey," Jackson said, his voice like steel. "Bank records, communication logs, anything that ties him to this." "You'll have it," David assured him. "But Jackson, be careful. If he's capable of this, he won't hesitate to go further to protect himself." Jackson's next move was clear. He couldn't sit idly by, waiting for more evidence to surface. He needed to confront Jeffrey, to look him in the eye and force the truth out of him that evening. He arrived unannounced at Jeffrey's estate. The sprawling mansion was as ostentatious as Jeffrey himself, every inch designed to scream wealth and power. A butler answered the door, his polite demeanor faltering slightly at Jackson's grim expression. "I'm here to see Jeffrey," Jackson said, pushing past without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Morris is in the study," the butler stammered, trailing behind him. Jackson found Jeffrey lounging in a leather armchair, a glass of brandy in hand. His cousin looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. Well, if it isn't the great Jackson Rivers," Jeffrey drawled. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Jackson didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know what you did, Jeffrey." Jeffrey's smile faltered, his grip on the brandy glass tightening. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Jackson snapped, stepping closer. "You sabotaged the yacht. You tried to kill me, to kill my family, just so you could take my fortune." Jeffrey laughed, a hollow, nervous sound. You're insane. You've always been a bit dramatic. But this, sabotage, murder. Come on, Jackson. I have proof. Jackson lied, his voice steady. The maintenance logs, your involvement in altering them. It's all there. So don't bother denying it. Jeffrey's expression darkened, the facade of charm slipping away. He leaned forward, his tone icy. Even if that were true, what are you going to do about it? Run to the police? You have no idea what kind of enemies you'd make by doing that. You mean people like you, Jackson shot back. Jeffrey's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room was heavy with unspoken threats. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back, a smirk curling on his lips. You're right, he said finally. I did it. I tampered with the yacht. But let's not pretend this was all about me. You were the one who chose your business over your family that day? If you'd been there, maybe things would have turned out differently. Jackson's fists clenched, his anger threatening to boil over. You destroyed everything, Jeffrey. And for what? Money. Power. Jeffrey shrugged. Isn't that what our family is built on, power? I just played the game better than you. Jackson stared at him. Disgusted? You're going to pay for this. I'll make sure of it. As Jackson turned to leave, Jeffrey's voice followed him, laced with a chilling warning. Be careful, Jackson. Dig too deep, and you might not like what else you find. Jackson returned to his mansion, his mind reeling from the confrontation. He had known Jeffrey was ruthless, but hearing the admission from his own mouth had made it all the more real. In the quiet of his study, Jackson stared at the fragment of wood on his desk, the last piece of the yacht, the last piece of his family's life. His resolve hardened. He wouldn't let Jeffrey get away with this. But more than that, he wouldn't let the past destroy what little hope he had left. Jasmine was out there, and if she truly was Zoey, then she deserved to know the truth about what happened. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, Jackson began planning his next move. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. Jackson knew he couldn't afford to waste any time. With the DNA test results still pending, he decided to take another step toward uncovering the truth. Jasmine's fragmented memories were the key, and he needed to help her unlock them. He invited Jasmine to visit his estate, framing it as an opportunity to show her the world of music that had once defined his life. She hesitated at first, wary of his intense interest in her, but eventually agreed. Jasmine arrived at the mansion late in the afternoon, her curiosity battling with a sense of unease. The grandeur of the estate was overwhelming. High ceilings, marble floors, and walls lined with photos and awards that chronicled Jackson's illustrious career. This place is incredible, she said, her voice tinged with awe as she stepped into the foyer. It used to be, Jackson replied with a faint smile. Now it's just a house. She followed him into a sunlit room dominated by a grand piano. The air was thick with history, and Jasmine felt an inexplicable connection to the space, as if she'd been there before. This was my family's favorite room, Jackson said, his tone soft. We spent countless nights here playing music together. My wife, Rachel, was a pianist, just like you, and Zoey, he trailed off, swallowing the lump in his throat. Zoey loved to sit beside her mother, pretending to play. Jasmine looked at the piano, her fingers twitching with an urge to touch the keys. Do you still play? She asked. Not anymore, Jackson admitted. Music stopped making sense after I lost them. Jasmine hesitated before stepping closer to the piano. She ran her fingers along the polished surface, her gaze thoughtful. Do you mind if I play? Be my guest, Jackson said, stepping back to give her space. As Jasmine sat down, her hands found the keys with ease, as if the instrument were an extension of herself. She began to play, and Jackson's breath caught in his chest. The melody was another piece of the composition he had written with Rachel and Zoey, a private song that no one else could have known. The notes filled the room, weaving a tapestry of emotion that transported Jackson back to the life he had lost. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he watched Jasmine intently, searching for any sign that she remembered. When she finished, the room fell silent. Jasmine looked up, her expression uncertain. That song, it feels so familiar, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It should, Jackson replied, his voice thick with emotion. It's the same melody you played at the competition. My family and I wrote it together." Jasmine blinked, her brow furrowing. "How is that possible? I've never seen this music written down anywhere. It's just always been in my head." Jackson stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Do you remember anything else? Anything about where you might have heard it?" Jasmine shook her head, frustration flashing across her face. "No, it's like a fog. I get these flashes sometimes. Water, darkness, voices, but nothing makes sense. I don't even know if they're real memories or just my imagination." "Close your eyes," Jackson said gently. "Try to picture the moments when you hear this melody in your mind. What do you see?" Jasmine hesitated, but complied, her hands resting on the keys as her eyes fluttered shut. "There's a woman," she said after a moment. "She's playing the piano, she's smiling, and there's a little girl sitting next to her. The girl is laughing and they're playing together." Jackson's breath hitched. "Can you see the woman's face?" Jasmine's brow furrowed deeper. "No, it's blurry, but I can feel. I think she loved me." Jackson clenched his fists to steady himself. "That woman was Rachel," he said, his voice trembling. "And the little girl was you, Jasmine. You were my Zoey." Her eyes snapped open, and she stared at him, confusion and fear etched across her face. "You don't know that for sure," she said, shaking her head. "I don't even know that for sure." "I do," Jackson insisted, his tone firm but kind. "You may not remember everything yet, but the music, the memories, they're not a coincidence. They're pieces of your life, Zoey. You've just forgotten them." Jasmine stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This is too much," she said, her voice rising. "You can't just show up and tell me who I am. I've spent my whole life trying to move forward. And now you're dragging me back into a past I don't even remember." Jackson approached her carefully, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not trying to overwhelm you. I just want to help you find the truth. Don't you want to know who you really are?" She stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping. Her shoulders. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Everything feels so confusing." Jackson's heart ached at her vulnerability. "Take your time," he said softly. "I won't push you. But if you ever need someone to help you make sense of it all, I'm here." Jasmine looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she said quietly. That night, after Jasmine had left, Jackson sat at the piano for the first time in years. He pressed a single key, the sound resonating in the silent room. Slowly, he began to play, his fingers finding the melody that had haunted him for so long. As the music filled the air, he allowed himself to hope. Jasmine might not fully believe it yet, but Jackson was certain. His Zoey was alive, and he would do whatever it took to bring her home. The days following Jasmine's visit were heavy with anticipation. Jackson replayed their time in the music room over and over in his mind. The way she had played, her flashes of memory, it all aligned too perfectly. But Jackson knew that feelings weren't enough. He needed hard proof, and the DNA test results couldn't come soon enough. Meanwhile, Jasmine found herself equally unsettled. The thought of being connected to Jackson, of having a family she couldn't remember, both thrilled and terrified her. At night, she lay awake staring at the photograph Jackson had given her, her thoughts swirling. The woman in the picture, the supposed Rachel, looked so warm, so kind. And the little girl, could that really have been her? A week later, Jackson received a call from David. "The investigator found something else," David said, his tone cautious. "Good or bad?" Jackson asked, bracing himself. "Potentially both," David replied. He uncovered additional tampering in the yacht's security footage from the day of the naufragio. It appears someone erased parts of the recording, but not all of it. There's enough left to implicate Jeffrey Morris. Jackson's heart sank and burned with fury at the same time. What did they find? A partial recording of Jeffrey giving orders to one of the crew members, David explained. "He was clearly involved, Jackson. The investigator says it's enough to reopen the case." Jackson gripped the edge of his desk, the weight of betrayal settling over him. "Good. Tell the investigator to prepare the evidence. I want Jeffrey brought to justice." "Understood," David said. "But Jackson, this will get messy. Jeffrey has connections, and he won't go down without a fight." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Let him fight. I'm not backing down." That same evening, the DNA results finally arrived. Jackson sat at his desk, the envelope trembling in his hands. He took a deep breath before tearing it open. His eyes scanned the words, and when he found the result, his world stopped. Probability of parentage, 99 and 99%. Zoey was alive. Jasmine was his daughter. Tears filled his eyes as he sank back into his chair, the confirmation hitting him like a tidal wave. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of joy piercing through the darkness. But with that joy came a renewed sense of urgency. Zoey deserved to know the truth, not just about who she was, but about what had happened to her mother and why their lives had been torn apart. The next morning, Jackson called Jasmine. "Can we meet?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jasmine hesitated. "Is this about the test?" "Yes," Jackson said. "I have the results, and I think it's time we talked." Jasmine's stomach churned. Part of her wanted to know, but another part feared the answer. Still, she agreed to meet him at the cafe where they had first spoken. Sitting across from Jackson, Jasmine felt the weight of his gaze. He slid the envelope across the table, his movements deliberate. "This is for you," he said. Jasmine stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. Slowly, she opened it, her eyes scanning the paper. When she saw the result, her breath caught. "It's true," she whispered. "I'm your daughter." Jackson nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You're Zoey, Jasmine. You survived, and I can't even begin to tell you how much this means to me." Jasmine's mind swirled with emotions. Relief, confusion, fear. She looked up at Jackson, searching his face for answers. "But why don't I remember any of it? What happened to my mother? Why was I alone?" Jackson's expression darkened. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. I have reason to believe the naufragio wasn't an accident." Jasmine's eyes widened. "What? You think someone did this on purpose?" Jackson nodded grimly. "I have evidence that Jeffrey Morris, my cousin, tampered with the yacht. He wanted to eliminate me to gain control of my fortune, but he didn't expect you and Rachel to be on board that day." Jasmine sat back, stunned. "So you think my mom, she didn't survive because of him?" "I don't know for sure," Jackson admitted. Pain etched across his face. "But I'm going to find out, and I promise you, Jasmine, I'll make sure Jeffrey pays for what he did." The revelation left Jasmine shaken, but it also ignited something inside her, a need to understand. She agreed to help Jackson uncover the full truth, even if it meant confronting memories she had long buried. Together, they began piecing together the fragments of her past. Jackson showed her more photos, shared stories of Rachel and Zoey's bond, and walked her through the house where she had spent her early years. Bit by bit, Jasmine began to remember. One night, as she sat at the piano in Jackson's study, a memory hit her like a wave. "I remember her," she said suddenly, her hands freezing on the keys. Jackson looked up, his heart pounding. "Rachel." Jasmine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She was singing. I was sitting next to her, and we were playing this song. She was so happy. But then everything went dark." Jackson approached her, his voice steady. "What else do you see?" Jasmine shook her head, her voice trembling. "Water, screaming. I was so scared she told me to hold on. But then she was gone. I don't know what happened. I don't know why." Jackson knelt beside her, his own tears falling freely. "It's okay," he said, his voice breaking. "You're safe now. We'll figure this out together." As the pieces of Jasmine's memory began to resurface, Jackson's determination solidified. Jeffrey had to be stopped, not just for him, but for Jasmine, and for Rachel. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew one thing for certain. The family Jeffrey had tried to destroy was far stronger than he had ever anticipated. The growing bond between Jackson and Jasmine had become a source of hope for them both. Yet, beneath the surface, danger loomed. Jeffrey Morris had caught wind of Jackson's investigation and knew his carefully hidden secrets were beginning to unravel. One evening, as Jackson and Jasmine sat in the music room reviewing old photos and memories, David called with urgency in his voice. "Jackson, you need to be careful," David warned. "Jeffrey's making moves. My sources tell me he's aware of your plans to expose him. He's not going to sit back and let this happen." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What kind of moves?" "Legal threats, for one," David replied. "But there's also talk of more aggressive measures. You need to stay vigilant." Jackson glanced at Jasmine, who was thumbing through an old scrapbook. He couldn't let Jeffrey's reach harm her, not after everything she had endured. "Thanks, David," Jackson said. "Keep me updated, and let the investigator know we need everything locked down." After ending the call, Jackson turned to Jasmine, masking his concern with a calm tone. "How are you holding up?" Jasmine looked up, a faint smile on her lips. "It's overwhelming, but it's starting to feel real. Like maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." Jackson felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't told her about the threats yet, unsure of how she'd react. But the truth was, they were running out of time. The next morning, Jackson received another blow. A letter from Jeffrey's lawyers arrived, accusing him of defamation and threatening a lawsuit. It was a blatant intimidation tactic, but it only fueled Jackson's determination. Later that day, David called again with an ominous update. "Jackson, I've been looking into Jeffrey's finances," David said. "He's been funneling money through offshore accounts, likely to cover up his involvement in the yacht sabotage. But there's more." Jackson frowned. "Go on." "There's evidence that Jeffrey hired private investigators to track your movements, and Jasmine's." Jackson's blood ran cold. "He's targeting her." "It's possible," David said carefully, "but I don't think he knows yet that she's Zoey. If he did, he wouldn't be watching. He'd be acting." The thought of Jeffrey closing in on Jasmine sent a wave of protectiveness through Jackson. "We need to make sure she's safe," he said firmly. "Double the security at the house and keep an eye on Jeffrey's people." "Already on it," David assured him. That evening, Jackson decided it was time to tell Jasmine the full extent of the danger they were facing. They sat in the study, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. "There's something I need to tell you," Jackson began, his tone serious. Jasmine set down the photo she had been holding, her expression shifting to concern. "What is it?" "It's about Jeffrey," Jackson said. "He knows I'm building a case against him, and he's not going to back down easily. I have reason to believe he might be trying to intimidate us. Or worse." Jasmine's eyes widened. "You think he'll come after me?" Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know for sure, but we can't take any chances. I've already increased security around the house." "You'll be safe here." Jasmine's hands clenched in her lap. "Why would he do this? What kind of person destroys their own family for money?" "Jeffrey's always been driven by greed," Jackson said bitterly. "He saw me as an obstacle to the life he wanted, and when Rachel and you were on that yacht, I think he saw it as an opportunity." Jasmine looked down, her mind racing. The thought that her life had been shaped by someone's cruelty was almost too much to bear. "We'll stop him," Jackson said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He won't get away with this." As the days passed, Jackson worked tirelessly with his investigator, compiling evidence against Jeffrey. Meanwhile, Jasmine began piecing together more fragments of her memory. One afternoon, as she wandered the house, she stumbled upon a room she hadn't seen before. The door was slightly ajar, revealing shelves lined with sheet music and a piano covered in dust. Curious, she stepped inside. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself held secrets. She approached the piano and ran her fingers along the keys, a wave of emotion washing over her. Images flashed in her mind. Rachel sitting at this very piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as she hummed a melody. Jasmine, or Zoey, as she was slowly beginning to accept, had been at her side, giggling as she tried to mimic her mother's movements. Tears filled her eyes as the memory faded. She sank onto the bench, overwhelmed by the sense of loss and longing. Jackson found her there moments later, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Jasmine," he said gently, sitting beside her. "What is it?" She looked up, her eyes red and filled with pain. "I remembered something," she said, her voice trembling. "She was here, my mom. She was so happy, so full of life, and now she's just gone." Jackson placed a comforting arm around her. "She's not gone, Jasmine. She's with us in every memory, every note of the music we shared." Jasmine nodded, though her heart still ached. "I want to help," she said suddenly, her tone resolute. "I want to stop Jeffrey. He can't get away with this." Jackson looked at her, a mix of pride and concern filling his chest. "Are you sure? This won't be easy, and it might bring back more painful memories." "I'm sure," Jasmine said, her voice steady. If he's responsible for what happened to her, for what happened to us, then he needs to pay. Together, they began laying out a plan to confront Jeffrey. Jackson knew the fight ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Jasmine was with him now, and they were ready to face whatever came next. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. For Jackson, the upcoming confrontation with Jeffrey wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him and Zoey. For Jasmine, it was a chance to stand up to the shadow of betrayal that had loomed over her entire existence. The night before they planned to face Jeffrey, Jackson and Jasmine sat in the study, reviewing the evidence they had gathered, the investigators' files, the DNA test results, and the recordings implicating Jeffrey were laid out across the table like puzzle pieces. "Are you ready for this?" Jackson asked. His voice low but steady. Jasmine nodded, her resolve unwavering. "He took everything from us. It's time he answers for it." The next morning, Jackson arranged a meeting with Jeffrey at the Rivers estate. He chose the location deliberately, his own home, where Jeffrey's betrayal had set its roots. Jeffrey, ever arrogant, accepted the invitation without hesitation, confident that Jackson's threats were empty. As Jeffrey arrived, his smug demeanor was on full display. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he strode into the study as though he owned the place. "Well, cousin," Jeffrey drawled, free, a mocking grin on his face. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this little reunion?" Jackson stood behind the desk, his posture rigid. Jasmine was seated to the side, her presence a quiet but powerful statement. "This isn't a reunion, Jeffrey," Jackson said coldly. "It's a reckoning." Jeffrey chuckled, his confidence unshaken. "Reckoning? That's a bit dramatic, even for you." Jackson gestured to the table, where the evidence was laid out. "Take a look. These are the pieces of your plan. The plan that killed my wife and almost took my daughter." Jeffrey's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning over to glance at the documents. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to pin your family's tragedy on someone else. It's pathetic, really. You tampered with the yacht," Jackson pressed, his voice rising. "You altered the stabilizer system to make it fail in rough waters. The maintenance logs, the crew's testimony, even the fragments of the wreck. Everything points to you." Jeffrey's jaw tightened, but he still tried to maintain his composure. "Even if any of this were true, you have no legal standing. You can't prove intent. That's where you're wrong," Jasmine said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was calm, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. Jeffrey turned to her, his expression shifting from irritation to curiosity. "Ah, the girl who thinks she's part of this mess. I'm surprised Jackson dragged you into his delusions." "I'm not just part of this," Jasmine said, rising to her feet. "I'm the reason your plan failed. I survived, Jeffrey. I'm Zoey Rivers, and I remember enough to know that you're responsible for what happened to my mother." For the first time, Jeffrey's confidence wavered. His eyes darted between Jackson and Jasmine, his mind racing. "This is absurd," he spat. But the edge in his voice betrayed his fear. "Absurd," Jackson snapped. "The DNA test proves she's my daughter. The investigator's report connects you to the sabotage. And this," he said, holding up the recording of Jeffrey ordering the crew to alter the stabilizer, "is the final nail in your coffin." Jeffrey's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The tension in the room was palpable as Jackson stepped closer to his cousin. "You stole everything from me, Jeffrey. You tore apart my family, all for money and power. But it ends here." Jeffrey's panic gave way to anger, his mask of arrogance cracking. "You don't understand how this world works, Jackson. You've always been too soft, too sentimental. This was never personal. It was business, and you were just another obstacle in my way." Jasmine's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You call destroying lives business. My mother died because of you. I was left alone, terrified, with no memory of who I was. All because of your greed." Jeffrey turned to her, his expression darkening. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing more than a pawn in Jackson's pathetic game of revenge." "Enough!" Jackson roared, his fists clenched. "You've manipulated and destroyed for long enough. It's over, Jeffrey." As if on cue, The door to the study opened, and 2 police officers stepped inside. Jeffrey's eyes widened in shock as they approached him. "Jeffrey Morris," one of the officers said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and tampering with evidence related to the Rivers yacht incident." Jeffrey's protests were drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. He shot Jackson a venomous glare as the officers escorted him out of the room. "You'll regret this, Jackson," he shouted. "This isn't over." But Jackson didn't flinch. He stood tall, his arm resting protectively on Jasmine's shoulder. As the door closed behind Jeffrey, a heavy silence filled the room. Jasmine turned to Jackson, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's really over," she said softly. Jackson nodded, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "It's over." They stood there for a moment, father and daughter united against the darkness that had tried to tear them apart. That evening, Jackson and Jasmine sat together in the music room, the weight of the day beginning to lift. Jasmine placed her hands on the piano keys, playing the familiar melody that had brought them together. As the music filled the room, Jackson closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that, despite everything, they could finally begin to heal. The morning after Jeffrey's arrest, the Rivers estate felt unusually quiet. For Jackson, the silence was not unwelcome. It was the quiet of relief, a space where anger and grief no longer drowned out the possibility of hope. Jasmine had stayed the night, at Jackson's insistence, and now the 2 of them sat on the sun-drenched patio overlooking the estate's sprawling gardens. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the chirping of birds added a touch of serenity to the moment. "Do you feel any different?" Jasmine asked. Breaking the silence, Jackson sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I feel lighter," he admitted. "For years, I've carried the weight of not knowing what happened. Now, there's clarity, justice." Jasmine nodded, though her thoughts lingered on her own sense of displacement. The DNA results had proven who she was. But knowing it and feeling it were 2 different things. "It's strange," she said, her voice hesitant. "I've spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a past. Now I have this whole other identity, but I don't know how to step into it." Jackson turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't have to rush," he said gently. "You've been through so much, Zoey. It's okay to take your time." The name still felt foreign to her ears, but Jasmine didn't correct him. Instead, she took a deep breath and said, "Tell me about her, my mom." Jackson smiled faintly, his mind conjuring memories of Rachel. "She was brilliant," he began, his voice tinged with both love and sadness. Not just as a musician, but as a person. She had this way of lighting up a room, making everyone around her feel seen and heard. And when it came to you, he paused, his eyes glistening. "She adored you, Zoey. You were her world. I remember how she'd sit at the piano with you in her lap, teaching you little melodies and laughing every time you hit the wrong notes. She used to say that your giggle was her favorite sound." Jasmine's throat tightened, tears threatening to spill. "I wish I could remember that," she whispered. Jackson reached over, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "It's okay. Even if you don't remember, those moments are still a part of you. They always will be." Later that day, Jackson took Jasmine to another part of the house she hadn't explored. A small room filled with Rachel's belongings, carefully preserved. It was like a time capsule of her life. Jasmine wandered through the room, her fingers grazing the fabric of Rachel's favorite shawl and the spines of old music books. On the desk sat a framed photo of Rachel and Zoey, their smiles radiating joy. "She was beautiful," Jasmine said, her voice thick with emotion. "She was," Jackson agreed. "And so are you." Jasmine turned to him, her lips trembling. "Do you think she'd be proud of me even after everything?" Jackson stepped closer, his expression filled with conviction. "She would be beyond proud. You survived something unimaginable, and you've grown into an incredible young woman. She'd be proud of your strength, your talent, and your heart." Jasmine let out a shaky breath, the words easing a part of her she hadn't realized was so tightly wound. Over the next few days, Jackson and Jasmine began rebuilding their relationship, taking tentative steps toward a new normal. They spent hours in the music room, playing the melodies that had once defined their family. At first, the sessions were bittersweet, But as time went on, the music became a source of joy rather than pain. One afternoon, as they played together, Jasmine stopped abruptly and looked at Jackson. "Do you think we could write something new?" she asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. Jackson blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Write something new." She nodded. "Something for her, for us, a way to honor everything we've been through." For a moment, Jackson was silent, his mind racing. He hadn't written music since Rachel and Zoey's disappearance. The idea had always seemed impossible, as though creating something new would betray the life he had lost. But now, looking at Jasmine, his Zoey, he felt something shift. "Let's do it," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Over the following weeks, the two of them poured their emotions into the music. The composition evolved into something raw and beautiful, a reflection of their pain, love, and resilience. They worked late into the nights, their bond growing stronger with every note. For Jasmine, the process was cathartic, a way to piece together the fragments of her identity. For Jackson, it was a way to finally move forward, while holding on to the memories that mattered most. When the piece was finished, they decided to share it with the world. Jackson arranged for a private concert, inviting close friends, family, and members of the music community who had supported him over the years. The night of the concert, Jasmine stood backstage, nerves twisting in her stomach. "You'll be amazing," Jackson said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "What if they don't like it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson smiled. "This isn't about them. It's about us. And no matter what, I couldn't be prouder of you." Jasmine nodded, drawing strength from his words. When they stepped onto the stage, the audience fell silent. Jackson introduced the piece, explaining its significance without revealing every detail. "This is a composition that represents loss, love, and the strength to keep going," he said, his voice steady. "It's a tribute to the people who shape us, even when they're no longer here." As the first notes filled the room, the weight of the past seemed to lift. Jasmine and Jackson played in perfect harmony, their connection palpable to everyone in the audience. The music soared, carrying with it the pain of what had been lost and the hope of what had been found. When the final note faded, the audience erupted in applause. But for Jackson and Jasmine, the moment wasn't about the acclaim. It was about healing, about finding their way back to each other. That night, as they sat together backstage, Jasmine leaned her head on Jackson's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For finding me, for believing in me, for not giving up." Jackson placed a kiss on her forehead, his heart full. "Thank you for coming back to me." The morning after the concert, the Rivers estate was bathed in golden sunlight, as if nature itself was celebrating the triumph of the previous night. For Jackson and Jasmine, the air carried a sense of renewal, a shared understanding that the storm of their past had finally settled. Jasmine stood in the garden, the piano keys still lingering on her fingertips. She watched as the wind danced through the flowers, her thoughts drifting between the concert and the journey that had brought her here. Jackson joined her, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, offering her a mug. She accepted it with a smile. "I was just thinking about last night. It felt right, you know, like we turned something painful into something beautiful." Jackson nodded, his gaze warm. Music has always been a way to express what words can't. Last night wasn't just about the notes, it was about telling our story. Jasmine sipped her coffee, her expression contemplative. "Do you think Mom would have been proud?" Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder. "More than you can imagine. She would have been right there, smiling the way she always did when she saw us at the piano." A gentle silence settled between them, the weight of their shared loss no longer heavy but tender, like an old scar. Later that day, Jackson received a call from David. "Good news," David said. "Jeffrey has officially been charged. The evidence you provided was enough to seal the case. He won't be walking free anytime soon." Jackson let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Thank you, David, for everything." "Just doing my job," David replied, though Jackson could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "What's next for you?" Jackson glanced at Jasmine, who was now sitting at the piano, her hands gliding over the keys as she hummed a soft tune. "Rebuilding," Jackson said simply. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jasmine officially moved into the Rivers estate, her once small world now expanding into something she had only dreamed of. The walls of the house, once heavy with grief, now echoed with laughter and music. Jasmine and Jackson continued to compose together, their collaboration a testament to their shared resilience. Their new piece, Requiem for Rachel, quickly gained attention in the music world, hailed as a masterpiece of emotion and storytelling. But the acclaim wasn't what mattered to them. What mattered was the journey it represented, their journey back to each other, and to the family they had nearly lost. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Jasmine spoke up. "Do you think it's possible to miss someone you don't remember?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jackson looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he said after a moment, "because missing someone isn't just about memories. It's about the connection you feel in your heart. And I know Rachel's still with us. In every note we play and every moment we share." Jasmine nodded, her eyes misty. "I feel her sometimes, like she's watching over us." "She is," Jackson said with certainty, "and she always will be." As the months passed, Jasmine began to explore more of her newfound identity. She started using the name Zoey again in personal settings, though she kept Jasmine as part of her professional life. It was her way of honoring both sides of herself, the girl who had survived and the woman who was rediscovering who she was. Jackson, too, found a new sense of purpose. For years, he had buried his love for music, unable to face the memories it brought. But now, with Jasmine by his side, he embraced it again, not as an escape, but as a way to celebrate the life he had rebuilt. On the anniversary of Rachel's passing, Jackson and Jasmine held a private memorial in the garden. They played her favorite song on the piano, their harmonies blending seamlessly as the sun set over the estate when the final note faded. Jasmine looked at her father, a small smile on her lips. "I think she would have loved that." "She would have," Jackson agreed, his voice steady. "And she would have been so proud of you." Jasmine leaned her head against his shoulder, the moment both bittersweet and comforting as the seasons turned. The Rivers' name became synonymous with hope and resilience. Their music touched countless lives. But for Jackson and Jasmine, the true victory was the bond they had rediscovered, a bond that no tragedy could break. One day, as they sat together composing, Jasmine turned to Jackson with a playful grin. "What do you think about a duet album?" she asked. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You mean letting the world hear my outdated piano skills?" She laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Your skills are anything but outdated. Besides, I think the world could use more of what we've created together." Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "You always did know how to convince me." In the years that followed, their duet became a reality, an album that chronicled their story through music. It wasn't just a collection of songs, it was a legacy, a testament to love, loss, and the unbreakable bond of family. And through it all, Rachel's memory remained a guiding light, her presence felt in every note, every smile. Every shared moment, the melody of their lives, once fractured, had found its way back together, stronger, richer, and more beautiful than ever before.